Hello, everyone. Thank y'all so much for joining us. Thank you for being here. We're super excited about this event. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank y'all for joining. We're gonna get started in a few moments. I'm just gonna let folks pop in. So hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. Feel free to drop your name, your pronouns, and where you're based in the chat, right? We just want to thank you for joining us as we have this important conversation on queering Black history and discussing the radical queer Black feminist legacy, leadership, and life of Pauli Murray. So we're going to get started in a few more moments to let more folks pop in. But like I said, feel free to drop your name, your pronouns, and where you're based in the chat. Would love to read where y'all are coming from. So hi, Jesse. He, she, they, we pronouns from Durham, North Carolina. Thank you for joining. Thank you, Kelly, for being here from Raleigh, Durham, North Carolina. Oh, wow. Folks from British Columbia, Newark, Delaware, Bowie, Maryland. Thank you for being here. Okay, from California, Baltimore, Philly. Okay, Philly's in the house, right? Oxford, Georgia, Maryland. Oh, hi, Nina. How are you doing, Nina? Thank you for being here. San Diego, Alabama. Wow, Dallas, Texas. Thank y'all so much for being here. We're super excited. We're going to get started soon, just letting more people come in. And also, if there's something that resonates with you from this conversation, please feel free to tag the Pauli Murray Center and Black Women Radicals on Twitter. And I'm also going to drop the Instagram profiles of our amazing panelists who we'll be introducing shortly. So just a few more moments, y'all. And oh, thank you for joining from Ohio, Quebec, Canada. Wow, this is great. Central Montana. Thank y'all so much for joining, right? We're gonna get started in a few moments. And also, if you don't mind sharing, what has Pauli Murray taught you, right? We're honoring the radical queer Black feminist legacy and leadership of Pauli Murray, right? Just please feel free to share in the chat, what has Pauli taught you and where you're from and your name and your pronouns, right? Thank y'all so much for being here. Great, great, great. So not to belabor any time, because we want to give as much time to our amazing panelists, right? But I'm going to introduce the conversation. Hello, everyone. My name is Jamie Swift. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the executive director of Black Women Radicals. And simply, Black Women Radicals is a Black feminist advocacy organization dedicated to uplifting and centering Black feminist activism around the world. I'm so excited for this event today in collaboration with the Pauli Murray Center for History and Social Justice on Queering Black History, a roundtable on the radical queer Black feminist legacy of Pauli Murray. And just as a little primer about the Pauli Murray Center, the Pauli Murray Center is a nationally significant history site anchored by Pauli Murray's childhood home built by his parents in 1898 at 906 Carroll Street in Durham, North Carolina. By connecting history to contemporary human rights issues, the Pauli Murray Center activates visitors of all ages to stand up for peace, equity, and justice. I really want to thank Sophia Ross Hurtado, who is the Program and Communications Director at the Pauli Murray Center, and Kristen Mouten, who is on our event today, who is the brainchild behind the Whose Shoes Do You Stand In campaign, for collaborating with Black Women Radicals on this event, right? And the Whose Shoes Do You Stand In campaign honors the queer and transmasculine identity and experiences of Pauli Murray, but also other unsung, particularly queer, trans, and gender expansive historical Black leaders during Black History Month. You can check that campaign out on BWR's Instagram page and also the Pauli Murray's Instagram page as well. In solidarity with Indigenous communities, I want to acknowledge and recognize the Muskogee Creek and other Indigenous nations who are displaced in the area I am situated in, which is outside of Atlanta, Georgia. Moreover, during Black History Month and beyond, I want to acknowledge and recognize our Black ancestors in the fullness of their lives, their joy, their pain, and their ascension. I also want to note that this conversation is a safe space. So any transphobic, queerphobic, anti-Black, ableist comments and actions are not allowed. So please respect the space and our guests. Last but not least, I want to say that this conversation, as I said before, focuses on the life, leadership, and legacy of the Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray. Born in 1910 in Baltimore, Maryland, and ascending and passing on in 1985, Murray was a pioneering activist, legal scholar, educator, Episcopal priest, and more. However, just like with many other Black feminist leaders, Pauli's legacy has been overlooked. And in this conversation, we will also interrogate why Pauli's transmasculine and queer identity experiences have been overlooked as well. Moreover, in centering Pauli's queer legacy, we are centering other Black, trans, queer, and gender expansive leaders who did not and continue not to get their just due in Black History Month and beyond. And in alignment with Naomi Simmons Thorne, I use he, him, or they, them pronouns for Pauli Murray, honoring their transmasculine experience, but also recognizing that there are other perspectives on Pauli's pronoun usage as well. So once again, thank y'all so much for being here. And next up, we will be introducing our amazing guests. Right. So first and foremost, we have the amazing Nana Brantuo. She uses she, her pronouns, who is an independent scholar, researcher, and writer based in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. Over the past decade, she has balanced teaching, facilitation, research, and advocacy appointments in the nonprofit sector and within higher education institutions. She has held several positions on policy advocate and strategies for several Black, immigrant, and Muslim nonprofit organizations, and is an adjunct lecturer at the George Washington University in the International Education Program. So thank you so much, Nana, for being here.
Dolores Chandler, they, them, is a mixed race, Black, trans, and gender nonconforming, tender, and tough human. They work as a radical social worker with over 10 years of experience as a facilitator, trainer, performer, writer, and angelic troublemaker. They entered into this work through drag kinging and gender performance, which has led them to community organizing. Dolores obtained their MSW in 2014 from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Dolores approaches their work through a violence prevention lens, as well as a racial and gender justice lens. Professionally, they have worked in sexual violence prevention education and supporting LGBTQ and POC youth leadership development. They currently live in Durham, North Carolina with their partner, their dog Tucker, and a most handsome lad, and a cat, Mona Luna Lovegood, aka Southern Snow Leopard.
That's so cute. I love that so much. Thank you so much, Kristen. Also, I forgot to say, forgive me, Nana, I want to add with Nana's bio, she writes and has been published on The Hill, PBS Newshour, the African American Intellectual History Society, OkayAfrica, AMAKA.Studio, and so much more. And Nana also co-curates the Caribbean Feminisms Series with Dr. Andrea Baldwin in partnership with Black Women Radicals. So shout out to you, Nana and Dolores. And I want to have the privilege of introducing Trinice McNally, she, her pronouns. Trinice is a Black queer feminist migrant and survivor who is nationally recognized transformative leader, student affairs professional, organizer, and creative committed to liberation of oppressed people. She is most passionate about developing strategies, initiatives, and curating spaces for historically marginalized populations to transform and thrive through programmatic advocacy and political education efforts. She hails from London, England, with her lineage traced to St. Mary's, Jamaica, by way of Miami, Florida. Trinice currently serves as the founding director of the Center for Diversity, Inclusion, and Multicultural Affairs at the University of the District of Columbia, is the founding organizer of the Envisioning Safety on Our Campuses DMV project, and founding director and CEO of TJ and Ford Culture, Education, and Organizing Group, a creative educational consultant agency committed to developing art, program, and organizing initiatives that mobilize societal change and transformation. So thank you so much, Trinice, for being here.
Next, I have the pleasure of introducing Naomi Simmons Thorne. She, her pronouns, is a graduate student and educator. She is currently at the University of South Carolina, where she studies teacher instruction, qualitative research, foundations, and philosophy of education. Naomi has served as a fellow at the Department of Education funded North Carolina Central University Research Institute for Scholars of Equity, as well as the Center for Minority Serving Institutions at the Rutgers Graduate School of Education. She was recently awarded the distinction of becoming the inaugural recipient of the Cheryl A. Wall Prize in Black Women's Studies. Between her studies, Naomi is working toward the completion of her first book, The Ontological Problem, Black Racial Ontology and the Politics of Sexual Difference. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Y'all, we got a badass lineup, period. Okay, this is gonna be an amazing conversation, right? So really getting into honoring Pauli Murray, I'm really interested when and how you were first introduced to Pauli Murray, and how did your initial encounter with Pauli and learning about his legacy and leadership impacts you personally and politically? So how were y'all introduced to Pauli, and how did their leadership, impact you? And anyone can jump in. Don't be scared, y'all. We friends here, okay?
Ooh, child. All right, let's break this down. So first of all, good evening. Thank you to everybody that's joined. I'm just really honored to be here. I think I'm introduced and reintroduced to Pauli several times in my life. The first time is when I'm actively working as a policy advocate that's focusing on Black immigrant communities. And at this time, it was just really lonely on Capitol Hill in terms of the effort to uplift and amplify Black immigrant voices. And I was just constantly looking to reading, in particular, past works around just reimagining legal systems, political systems in ways that meet the needs of the most marginalized people in particular. And so I come across Pauli's work initially, Jane Crow, and then as I'm working on my dissertation, which focuses on Black student migrations from Africa and the Caribbean to the US and the worlds they make, the nations they build, I come across Pauli again, because Pauli is really active advocate from first setting foot in DC, even before. And I encounter that like Pauli is at an international student assembly, and then years later ends up teaching in Ghana, really building out like the beginnings of the legal profession and legal education. And so I was just deeply fascinated with the mobility of a Black person who's trans, who's queer, who's really like helping these students think through in a different way what legality can look like in a very new post-colonial world. And just from there have just always been inspired by Pauli's just legacy to deeply, like to be critical, to think, to archive, to read, to just deeply engage with the law in a way that is non-traditional, it's just how I encounter Pauli in life.
Thank you, Nana. Thank you so much.
Oh, Trinice, I saw you taking that mic off. All right. So it's always hard to like trace back, right? Like when was the moment, right? That I learned about who Pauli Murray was. So for me, I was introduced to Pauli Murray back in 2013. And I was at the time, I think Nana used the word lonely to describe being on Capitol Hill. And I was very lonely in the MSW program at UNC's School of Social Work. And so I was invited by the Pauli Murray Project at the time before it became the Center for history and social justice and I was invited in sort of in my capacity as a performer, as a drag performer, to sort of participate in like a weekend roundtable that brought together scholars and professionals from various different aspects of Pauli Murray's sort of work and life. So academics, teachers, folks from divinity schools, lawyers, and so it was really, we were gathered in the spirit of who Pauli Murray was, which was really to, think about the world from the perspective of many different disciplines and ways of being in the world. And the minute that I encountered Pauli Murray, like I, at the time, in fact, was, if you're familiar with with the social work, a master in social work, there's usually like a internship or field placement. And unsurprisingly, there was not one available that felt like really spoke to my interests or needs at the time. So, I rolled up into the Pauli Murray Project and was like, I want you. And I ended up doing my my field placement there with the organization. But I will say that there's always this particular moment that I want to share about with folks, because it's a video clip that I saw of Charles Kuralt doing this PBS show On the Road. And this was back in 1977. And you can't really find that footage like online. But I saw this interview, Charles Kuralt interviewing Pauli Murray about sort of, this was right before they were returning to give the sort of the sermon at the Chapel on the Cross at UNC's campus. And I know I'm not using the right language for that because I'm not religious by any means, so I'm like messing up all the words. But there's a moment when he is asking Pauli Murray about sort of their identity as a mixed race Black person, as, in that interview, like as a woman in the world, and the response. And so he sort of puts it to them like, what's that like? Is that must be pretty crazy, or pretty wild. And Pauli's response is like, yeah, it's like riding wild horses. And they just like talked about every single aspect of their identity, and I remember sitting across from this older version of Pauli Murray and thinking like, how amazing that this person exists in the world, that like just the fact of their existence was affirming. So simultaneously, this like, how amazing, and why didn't anybody tell me? And so that's really when the like sort of like the obsession clicked for me with Pauli Murray. So if you ever get your hands on that one clip, it's a beautiful excerpt, and it's really powerful to watch.
Thank you so much, Dolores. I love that, because I always call Pauli intersectionality's poster child. So everything that you said completely resonates with me as far as why, when I found their existence, for one, I was so angry because why did I have to do such in-depth research to find this person that was just me? My first introduction to Pauli Murray was reading Freedom's Daughters by Lynn Olson, unsung heroines of the civil rights movement. And she goes back from the beginning, from 1960. She starts way before that, because the civil rights movement, it didn't just start in the 60s. It was something that had continued. But I read about how Pauli was arrested in 1940 while cross-dressing with her girlfriend, protesting Jim Crow, and my mind was just blown. As a queer Black woman who always felt like my queerness was something that was other on top of the otherness of my Blackness, and just finding Pauli, the miracle of their existence in 1940. It was just absolutely mind-blowing. So I've definitely been obsessed with Pauli since then. So I definitely resonated with that. So thank you.
Yeah, I think for me, in a similar sense, I'm trying to put it the first memory. And I think something that Nana started us off with is like we've been introduced and then reintroduced over time, right? Like just in different iterations. I think is I have come into myself in my Black feminist politics and my queerness. And I was first introduced to him when I was running the LGBTQ Center at North Carolina Central University. And the students were protesting about something. I was always the advisor, so I just was there. I was like, what is today about? What are the demands? It was more like, now we're gonna click up, we're gonna turn up. At this same time, the LGBTQ Center of Durham was also being built by Helena Craig. So that's when I was like introduced to Helena, and we ran up on, is it Chapel Hill Street in Durham, I think, where the mural is. And I was just like, so who is this? Because everyone was taking pictures. Everyone was enamored with this person. And I was like, who is this person? And why do I not know who this person is? And Helena Craig told me who Pauli Murray was, which I think is super important in the ways that community and divine times in our life bring us to people. You know, like just for that time, I had just moved there. I was married to my ex-wife at the time, and it was super like isolating time to be in Durham, which is cool, right? But like, I don't know anybody here. I'm running this LGBTQ center. The campus hates all their queer folks, but they're pretending. Interesting times. So I was like, oh, and I run up on Pauli Murray at this mural, right? And I think the thing that brought me closer to wanting to learn more about them was their relationship to the Episcopal Church, because parts of my family had grew up Episcopal, which is very, very like in Caribbean culture, like everybody claims that they are Christian and they happen to be Episcopal or some type of Anglican, you know what I'm saying, type of trajectory in terms of religion. But what really got me curious, and it feels like almost like a love story, because love stories for me feel like a committed period over time where I want to learn more and more and more and more and more about you. And that feels like how I feel about so many of queer Black people in particular that we always erase during Black History Month. So shout out to y'all for putting together this event because it's so fucking important. And I learned that they had went to Howard. And I think my relationship shifted as I went to Bethune-Cookman University, which is the only Black institution founded by a Black woman. I always have to say that. But I learned about their contentious relationship with Howard University. And I had recently been spending time with one of my mentors, Beverly Guy Sheftall, who had been able to release some unpublished papers about Lucy Diggs' slow experience at Howard University. So that's when I started to make the connections like, oh, all of my life, my whole graduate dissertation about HBCUs becoming liberatory environments is a pipe fucking dream, because everyone that attends these institutions has a contentious we all have contentious relationships with the institutions. So I think that Pauli Murray's experience from the first day they get there and the dean tells them, I don't even know why women in law school, to them then becoming one of the leading figures, not just at Howard University, but across the globe in terms of like legal scholarship before Kimberly Crenshaw, like before CRC, before all of that. I got like really curious about my relationships to HBCUs. And why did I think that I was so important when niggas like Pauli Murray had went to Howard University, and they should have been grateful that they went to Howard University. And like, what is that relationship between Black women and gender expansive people and trans folks at HBCUs, that only when we die, right, are we valuable? And that was like where it started for me, just thinking about their relationship. When you think about Lucy Diggs Slow and how Mordecai Johnson like killed her, that's why she died, right? Because of what he did to her. And so thank God, all the gods, right, that wasn't Pauli Murray's story. But also, I think something I also have to say is like something Jamie and I often talk about is when we study these folks, what are the lessons that we need to be getting? Because like our people get sick, right? Pauli Murray died from cancer, right? Like what is that relationship to a life full of struggle, disrespect, erasure, invisibilization, and like being hospitalized over and over again for someone to tell you that your gender is not real? What do you think that does to the Black body? So it really got me to thinking about like, what is my relationship going to be to these institutions? And really, if I'm more honest, I should have been more careful, right? And like, what is my engagement with movement going to be? Right? Because that's a lot of the work that Pauli Murray was trying to get us to think about when they were calling out these people. I feel like they're the original call out nigga because, and when they got denied from those schools, what would they do? They would blast it on the newspaper. They would share. They wouldn't keep it to themselves, right? And that's why like archives are so important because they weren't afraid. I was like, before Twitter, you feel me? But like now it was like, no, I'm gonna tell everybody about what y'all said because y'all supposed to be the NAACP. Y'all supposed to be representing me in court. So why y'all not here? So that's like where my like really, I think pushing me to think critically about just because something is Black, it doesn't mean it's radical. And we need to be moving towards what's radical.
I'll go ahead and add lastly, and I just wanted to also shout out to National Wear Your Bonnet to Work Day. It's today. I'm making it today, so you know. So I'll say that for all of the criticisms that I have about the Black Lives Matter movement, one of the things that I really do appreciate about my time having spent as an activist and organizer in that space was like the intergenerational spaces that it created in the culture and context of Black radical intellectualism and this culture of Black study that was really nourished during that time. So I learned about Pauli Murray in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement, where I also received my my first exposure to Black radical histories. But Pauli Murray didn't take particular political significance, didn't assume political significance for me per se until about 2018. In 2018, here in South Carolina, there was a murder of a Black transgender woman who lived right on the border of South Carolina and North Carolina, and her name was Sasha Wall. And me and a couple of my like organizer friends, some of whom are in this chat, are in this event, ended up like organizing a rally to commemorate this person's life and also to bring awareness to like the epidemic of Black trans homicides. And in researching and preparing like my remarks to like open up the space, I had come across someone referring to Pauli Murray as trans. And the irony and continuity could not have been more consistent because this person that I was referring to, we almost didn't even know that they were trans because the police had misgendered them. And so many people had misgendered Pauli Murray to me when I heard them talking about Pauli Murray. So the continuity was really striking for me, and it really made me really oppositional to that particular violence with the way that Pauli Murray is remembered or misremembered.
Thank y'all so much for sharing how y'all were first introduced to Pauli. And I just want to say like the comments in the chat are just popping, y'all, because people are resonating. So thank y'all. And Kristen, yes, I didn't mean to take over. So
no, you're good.
Hop in with the question.
I just wanted to say thank you so much for sharing, Naomi, Trinice. Thank you so much. Y'all's words have very much moved me and a lot of people in the chat. And I also just want to thank everyone who came here today. We have introduced some people to Pauli Murray for the first time ever, and I think that that is an amazing thing. So thank you so much to the people who are coming. Welcome to Pauli Murray's legacy. On that note, our next question. In 2019, Naomi's powerful piece that everyone here should absolutely read, we're going to drop it in the chat, titled Pauli Murray and the Pronominal Problem, a De-Essentialist Trans Historiography, was published in the Activist History Review. Naomi argues that Murray's papers may one day prove to be the United States' largest and most complete reserve of trans historical primary sources, and that scholars have assigned to Murray the identity of a cisgender woman largely on the grounds of biological determinism. So given that Pauli left such an extensive archive about his struggles with gender identity and gender dysphoria, why do you think that there is such a refusal and resistance to acknowledge Pauli's transmasculine and queer identity and experiences?
don't want to go first, but I just have to say the drag is in the question. The drag is in the
The drag is
in the question.
It is.
I have my little notes here, and I feel like I wrote down the answers like I was taking a short, like an essay test. I was like, cis heterosexism, assimilation, respectability politics.
All of it.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
I mean, I think it also calls bullshit. I think it calls bullshit on people's feminist praxis. What is your feminism? Like, what does that mean? And what does it mean for you to internally do your work around maybe your own internalized shit, your internalized transphobia, what that means? Why is it so significant to not even that? Why is it so simple and so easy to erase something so significant about this wonderful, phenomenal fucking person? Like, why are we not listening and not reading to the art and really, really reading the archive? Like, the piece I deeply appreciated and the question posed as well, because I had to sit with that. And I was like, yeah, this is, especially if we're engaged in the work of recovering, uncovering, revising histories, and in particular, centering those who would most deeply understand and resonate the experience, the life of Pauli. Like, why is it so easy for us to say, nah, we're not gonna have this conversation. We're not gonna do this work. It's uncomfortable. Maybe that's it. It's uncomfortable.
I mean, Nana, to your point as well about the, it calling bullshit on someone's praxis, that I think that there's, to that, I would also add that there's something about when somebody becomes a hero, that when somebody becomes claimable in that regard, and when I think that sometimes when we've claimed someone as a hero, we want them to be just ours, and that they can't belong to anybody else, because there's not enough, especially for those of us who are systemically oppressed and marginalized. Like, we don't have enough heroes, so you can't taint any of our heroes. And so it's also asking folks to really think about, like, what is the fear there? Like, what are you afraid you're going to lose if you open up to the complexity of who a person is? And also in particular through the lens of feminism and feminist theory, then what is it? It's almost as though by virtue of Pauli's, masculine identity, that somehow cheapens Pauli's ability to have been like a cornerstone of Black feminist theory. And, and that's very, I think, challenging for folks to confront.
I'll also want to add, so before I get on my soapbox, I want to just push back a little bit on the preface of this question. So in the preface of the question, we say, given that Pauli left such an extensive archive, which is true, but I want to push back on that just a tiny bit, because Black trans people historically and traditionally have not had access to historical documentation or archival legibility. So we can't rely on the archives and what is left behind to legitimate and establish the presence of Black trans people. We have to know Black trans people have always existed by fact, and we have to just leave it there. If we rely on the archives, we get to this place where Pauli Murray and maybe 2 or 3 other people are the only Black trans people we've ever known. And we can't rely on that as legitimate, right? So I want to just push back on that just a tiny bit, but then I also want us to confront the paradox. If we know that Black trans people have not had access to archival legibility and historical documentation, how do we now confront this person who documented themselves in the methodologically, institutionally, epistemologically correct way? How do we hold those two things together? And when we try to confront that paradox, I have seen a number of really interesting arguments for why Pauli Murray should not be recognized as trans, or why people just refuses to recognize Pauli's trans masculinity. And so, of course, you're going to hear the claim of historicity, which is almost the most ludicrous one. So you'll hear people say something along the lines of, well, Pauli Murray didn't identify as trans. Pauli Murray also did not identify as queer. And Pauli Murray also really did not like the term Black and preferred Negro. And when Negro fell into disrepute, Pauli Murray preferred terms that accentuated or highlighted their mixed race status. So we can't say that just because Pauli Murray didn't identify as trans, that we can't use trans as a category to think about Pauli Murray's life, especially when we say that when we like hark so much on what Pauli Murray did not identify as, we forget what Pauli Murray actually did identify as. And if you look at the language that Pauli Murray used for himself, invertedly sexed, pseudo-hermaphrodite, these are not terms that cisgender people use to recognize themselves. It's just not. And we also have to remember how long the road of development it took to get to the term transgender. Pauli Murray started using the term invertedly sexed in the 1930s, and Pauli Murray got that from Havelock Ellis, who was a British sexologist who coined that term really early in the 20th century. So Pauli Murray started using that term for themselves. The term transsexual did not come around until 1930s in German, and then 1950s. The English iteration came in the 1950s, but it didn't really enter popular cachet until 1969 with this book called The Transsexual Phenomenon. And when the term transsexual came out, it already had a surgical kind of connotation to it. So even though the transsexual phenomenon came out in 1969, you see Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera in the 1970s still referring to themselves as transvestite and not transsexual because of the surgical connotation. The term transgender did not really enter popular cachet until the 1990s. This is well after Pauli Murray passed away. So the term transgender did not come into play until like the 1990s. And that's with thanks to and attributable to people like Leslie Feinberg, for example, who in 1994 publishes Transgender Warriors. And the subtitle of that book is really important because in the Leslie Feinberg subtitles that book, Transgender Warriors, From Joan of Arc to Dennis Rodman. So when trans people first came up with the term transgender, this is how expansively they were thinking about the term transgender. Now we have a very reductive identitarian concept of transgender, but when it was first iterated, it had a more expansive definition. So under this more expansive definition, I think Pauli Murray definitely fits under that category. Pauli Murray found non-cisgender words to describe themselves. Not only did Pauli Murray have these identity markers, but Pauli Murray also played around with different names, including Paul, Lenny, Oliver, right? So this whole notion of historicity is just really weird to me. Not to mention that people also say, well, Pauli Murray presented as a woman or called themselves a woman and so forth. Pauli Murray made sacrifices, right? Pauli Murray made sacrifices. Pauli Murray, you have to remember that there came social, economic, and juridical suicide for being transgender in the United States for a very long time. And some people, and I would even argue still to this very day. But Pauli Murray was arrested, institutionalized multiple times for cross-dressing, institutionalized multiple times was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and like all of these things, right? And you have to also think about the economic context as well, because had Pauli Murray actually presented consistently in their preferred presentation style, that would have also been economic suicide. If Pauli Murray decided to, present and perform their gender in the way that they preferred, they would have either been a working blue collar, like Black trans men, or on a street corner, like Black trans women, right? And based on Pauli Murray's sense of propriety, Pauli Murray's faith, and also Pauli Murray's professional ambitions, that was not feasible for them. And so they made sacrifices. So for me, my retroactive recognition of Pauli Murray's pronouns is my attempt to look at the sacrifices Pauli Murray made and say, I want a world where Pauli Murray did not have to make those sacrifices. And that's why I decide to use the pronouns that I do.
Child. Naomi. And I want Trinice to hop in, but I just want to say, Naomi, I want to give you your flowers, sis, because thank you for bringing this to the fore. Thank you for your brilliance. I know that this was not easy and you faced a lot of contention and debate about writing this piece, but you deserve all your flowers because you are just brilliant, and you should see the chat. Thank you for the context. Thank you for pushing us to go inside of ourselves, right? And to really interrogate and critique ourselves, to critique Black feminist thought and behavior and where we're failing, right? And also resisting against, people's ownership, quote unquote, of Pauli Murray and biological essentialism. So thank you so much to Naomi Simmons Thorne. That was a read, definitely. Thank you so much. And I want Trinice, I'm sorry, to pop in. Thank you again, Naomi.
Nah, go ahead and pop in, because I thought the question was a drag, but I mean, first of all, I'm signing up to take all your courses and sending everybody your way, because the way that you can contextualize history in such a way that is I'm over here like, okay, so I didn't understand that, but now I understand this. Okay, now I have the terminology, so it was wrong. It wasn't the 40s, it was actually the 60s. It's like, yeah, just thank you for your scholarship, because in your work, because I don't think that people really understand the time and the commitment and what at your expense, to write, curate, and speak with us. So there's nothing for me to add. What Naomi didn't say? What am I gonna add?
I'm sorry, I'm cracking up over here. Okay. Thank you, Trinice. Dolores, I'm sorry, I don't want to cut you off, Dolores.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely I'm listening to you, and I was like, I'm in school, I'm in class now, and I am definitely paying attention. But I do, again, I think that it really speaks to the importance of your scholarship, Naomi, and the scholarship in general of Black, trans, queer folks who are viewing archives and archival footage or archival documents through our lens, our very particular lens that we have. And that's what is lost when we are not able to get access, right, to all of this evidence and all of this documentation that is so accessible to very specific folks in a white dominant culture, right? And I think also on a personal perspective, right? So that question of thinking about right, the context, right? Whether it's regarding language or someone's lived experience, and also how we in this moment, in the present moment, look back on the choices that somebody made around the ways that they identified themselves. So what I love about even being able to be in this conversation is that it invites me to think about okay, so what is it about me or my perspective or my hold on pronouns that I feel like a little rub when I hear like he him pronouns in reference to Pauli Murray, right? And so the I think that what like the value in like asking ourselves, right, like what our hold is on certain language or certain terminology is like the opportunity ultimately, again, that I think that the kind of world that Pauli Murray was trying to work toward, right, was that we could have these conversations and that we could apply our experience and our scholarship and our knowledge to the conversation. So I think that I'm just like really pleased, you know, just like from, again, the like personal, and this just reminds me, right, like you can't separate the personal from the professional, right, which is, again, another argument that people use to erase Pauli Murray's you know, gender identity, sexual identity, right? And that it's so clear that we are informed, and that Pauli Murray's like whole entire scholarship, right, and contribution to the legal field and to feminist theory is informed by Pauli's being in their body and in the world.
Ooh, y'all, we being schooled today. We are being schooled today. And no, thank y'all so much. And for the next question, I want to like kind of shift to a greater narrative regarding particularly Black History Month and who do we honor as Black, quote unquote, Black leaders, right? And I've had this conversation with many of my friends on this panel, right, about who is seen and not seen as a leader based on many things, right? So the question is, how has the gender binary, colorism, transphobia, queerphobia, ableism, respectability politics, and more impact who is seen as a leader or not, particularly during and even beyond Black History Month? And also, as a follow-up, may you all please offer suggestions on other meaningful ways to engage with and even critique historical Black leaders so there's a more fuller and constructive view of their lives. So I'm gonna drop both of those in the chat. I know that was like a loaded question, but here we are with a loaded conversation, y'all.
I feel like it was a two-part, so I want to answer just the first part and just like be in conversation with comrades and see like what comes up. I think the first thing, I don't know, folks may like this, I'm looking around. I don't think they had us in mind. I don't think that they had queer people in mind. When Carter G. Woodson started Black History Month, it started off first as a week in the 20s. Right? Like, so let's just think about time and history and place. I don't think that they were thinking of queer people. And I think at the inception of this week, you know, it being based in wanting to study the achievements and the celebrations of Black people at that time, right? We haven't even hit Jim Crow, right? When we get to the 20s, right? Because it doesn't even become a month until like 40 years, like really just thinking, I do not think that queer people and gender expansive people, because there wasn't I don't even want to say large, I would say because maybe it wasn't rooted in scholarship that queer people and trans people even existed. And that's what we have used. Thank you, Naomi, again, for pointing it out as that is what brings us legitimacy, what exists in scholarship. So I can't wait to talk about archives because I have like so many thoughts about that. But I don't think they had us in mind. And I think that that's oftentimes the critique that we even offer around feminisms, right? Like with First Wave, they did not have Black women in mind, right? And when they were creating Black History Month, they did not have queer and trans people, you know, in mind. I would argue they probably didn't even have women in mind as well, right? Because the most celebrated figures were still men, right? Based in instilling that dominance. So I think that that's my first answer. And I want you to repeat the second question, the generative meaningful ways to engage and critique historical Black leaders. Yeah, I don't think there's more than 25 ways to skin this cat. I think it is really about access and how you need to move and navigate. It feels like the Black radical tradition has taught us so many ways of what happens when you speak up, right? And you speak truth to power, the way that retaliation works at institutions specifically, hell, the way that retaliation works in movement, organizations, right? When you decide to speak up about what's happening, I think that really contextualizes how you engage with the critique. But I think we should really interrogate what Pauli was trying to teach us, right? Why did Pauli leave those papers to their niece? Right? Why were there hundreds of boxes at their home? I think that there was something that they were onto, which we all know, right? That needed to be told and needed to be shared from a particular perspective, because otherwise they just would have been seen as maybe a legal scholar, right? Maybe, if they would have even been given that credit when they discarded their papers, when they were actually in school in that process. So I think the first thing is they didn't have us in mind. They never do. And the second thing is the ridicule and the retaliation and the ways that people would like to navigate for themselves, right? And I think that the compromise that Pauli Murray made has made it possible for us to even have this conversation, so that Black studies is even a course, right? So that women and gender studies is even a course, that we even have LGBTQ resource centers. But I think that's also about a part of the problem, because when we accept those, they become the benchmarks, right? And then nothing else happens as a result of them systemically and institutionally.
I mean, I also think, just going back to, like, they didn't have us in mind, much less like cisgender Black women in mind. And what I wrote down and like what came up for me, and this is like not a fully formed, it's fully felt, but it's not a fully formed like thought, but that again, ultimately, that it's all that the definition of like, it's all in relationship to white dominance and white supremacy culture, right? So if we can get away from the fact of like defining our as Black and brown folks, even can we like extend past, right, what white supremacy culture has given us to like identify ourselves with, and perhaps stop trying to identify ourselves in relationship to white supremacy culture, then we will learn and we will remember that the gender binary was given to us and imposed on us by colonialism, by white European settlers. And so we like have, it's there, like it's so possible for us to extend our reach beyond what white supremacy culture has given us. And that critique, right, the punishment that non-binary and queer folks are subjected to for extending their reach beyond that comes, I think, when we limit ourselves to defining ourselves only in relationship to whiteness. And I don't even know fully what that look. I mean, like here I am in the world, like the product of like imperialism, right? Like that there's, so I just feel like that there's the gift that like gendered expansive folks bring to the world is the invitation to think beyond what like colonialism and white supremacy culture has imposed on the world.
So to answer that question, and I am about to get really controversial, but to answer that question, I think that like we should probably just go like straight for the jugular to really kind of emphasize this problem of who is constitutive of a Black leader, and when do Black leaders fall into disrepute based on these attributes that we seem to have institutionalized as being not respectable in this like Black radical civil rights kind of tradition, right? And to that regard, I think it's really important to bring up Malcolm X right now. So in the early 90s, there was a biography of Malcolm X that was published by a scholar named Bruce Perry. And Bruce Perry published this biography, and when he published it, it became, there was like a firestorm that it created among Black intelligentsia, None the least because one of the things that Bruce Perry writes in this biography, he mentions the fact that Malcolm X, over the course of his lifetime, had various sexual relationships with and possibly romantic relationships with men and non-cis women. He also writes about a transgender partner Malcolm X also had as well. And so this, of course, like creates a firestorm among the Black intelligentsia. About 2 to 3 years after Bruce Perry publishes this biography, there is a book that comes out called Malcolm X in Our Own Image, I want to say. And this is a book that it's an anthology, and it's an anthology where the contributors are a variety of Black male scholars. So if you're thinking about the 90s, all the usual suspects are in there. You have Cornel West and everybody else, right? And so this book is like pretty much published as a corrective to Bruce Perry's biography. And of course, the subject of sexuality comes up. And while most people in the book have a very while most of the people in the book also like are pretty much repudiating the book and claiming that it's like really bad scholarship and so forth, there are some sympathetic readings of Bruce Perry's scholarship. Robin D.G. Kelley does a very sympathetic reading. Bell Hooks also responds to this, to Bruce Perry's biography as well. And one of the things that she said that I always found really profound, she says, nothing that Bruce Perry wrote in that biography takes away from what Malcolm X contributed. And that is something that I think is really hard for people to accept. But about 20, 25 years after Bruce Perry's biography, we have Manning Marable come out with another biography of Malcolm X, corroborating the same exact research. Apparently, we trust Manning Marable to tell us about capitalism, but we do not trust him to tell us about Malcolm X's sexuality. And so this is a really good example of who's constitutive of a leader and why when people have certain attributes, whether it's disability, whether it's fatness, whether it's sexuality, that we like stop seeing them as leaders. And I think this is a really good example because Malcolm X, of course, is a paragon of masculinity for many sections of Black radical space. And, Malcolm X has this kind of image and legacy, and people are very protective over it. But it remains the question, why does Malcolm X cease to be a leader when he has relationships outside of the context of cisgender women? Why does Pauli Murray not get to be remembered when Pauli Murray's transmasculinity comes into question? And so these questions, I think, are really enduring, and they point to a very institutionalized cis-sexism, heterosexism, right, and all of these other isms and phobias that exist in these Black spaces. And as Trudy said best, just because something is Black, it's not radical. And unless we actually do the work of making these Black spaces radical, this is the kind of histories and legacies that unfortunately we get left with.
My goodness. Thank you for that. Thank you for everything that y'all are saying. And I'm even thinking about this now, even in a larger transnational context. I think about never learning about Pauli Murray's contributions in terms of Ghana, the nation state, the state of the Black stars, right? This nation building project that invites numerous people from the diaspora, and what it means for Pauli to have to flee Ghana, knowing Nkrumah has been watching very eyefully, knowing that Pauli is engaging a new generation of legal scholars and encouraging them, and Pauli writes about this, encouraging them to be incredibly critical, no matter what, encouraging them to think of the law as a tool for equity and justice in ways that they had not been introduced. And so what it even means for me, when I think about Pauli, I think of Pauli's almost like this entryway for me to become much more critical of my own identity, my own nation state, what it means to be a queer Ghanaian in the United States, watching queer feminists in Ghana, watching the queer and trans community fighting, in what feels like almost like this horrible irony of what Pauli was speaking about while building up this profession. People will use constitutions, they will use laws, they will use institutions across boards to maintain what has been what has been patriarchy, what has been white supremacy, like globally. And in so many ways, I'm so thankful for constantly being introduced to poly and also speaking to people in these contexts and just learning and expanding more, because it could be a Black nation state, okay? And it's not safe for you across time and space, and you could have contributed significantly. There's no reason for us to not to know, like being able, and I wanted to show this because I purchased a used copy of Pauli's text that they co-write, and this is what's used to teach students across who are enrolling in Ghana. And there are even people who are from ethnic groups and regions that are like at the time where Pauli is enrolled, who and is teaching, who are speaking to their difference in their country and trying to think through how they can use the tools they've provided for them. So it's just so, I'm thankful for this. And I was just thinking about this as well. You can't critique Nkrumah for some people, but we should. We have to. We have to also speak to the deep harms and what does it mean for the leader who is radical, but who's also he was deeply sexist. He was deeply patriarchal. And many people who across women and gender expansive people will never truly know the impact of the harm that was done as well. So also making space for that as we talk about figures throughout Black History Month and beyond.
Oh, do I have time to add something? I saw you coming up.
No. Yes, Dolores, you can go right ahead. We're going to have one more question. No, please add, Dolores, by all means.
I think that, you know, this question, this thing around, I guess what I wonder is like what it is like for folks to engage or to think about critique as potentially an act of love. And because when I think of all of Pauli Murray's scholarship, that all of that critique and the letter writing that was viewed as, that was villainized, right, and viewed as you know, as misplaced or presumptuous, that came from a deep love of Pauli's home, of Pauli's people, of Pauli's history, and if not love, then at least a willingness to hold contradiction, you know, on par, to hold these contradictions and allow space for contradicting identities or conflicting histories to exist. And it also makes me think of my own experience being, you know, like being alienated, or as, you know, folks in the School of Social Work would probably say, me alienating myself, or being, you know, vilified or being viewed as, you know, disruptive. That ultimately the critique was an act of love for, not for an institution, but for like a vocation of like wanting something to be better and seeing the full potential of what something could be. And that when we do show up with our critique, that ultimately, at least I think that it's out of a deep love.
It absolutely is. Oh,
yeah,
sorry.
I don't know. No, it's okay. I don't know. I just like,
no, that's real. It is.
It absolutely is. And it actually reminded me of something that Pauli Murray once said. I don't remember the book that I read it in, but it talked about how a lot of Pauli Murray's work was just democratic eschatology. I want America to be who she says she is in the Constitution. Be who you say you are. Where is the freedom? Who is it really for? Who gets it? Who gets to enjoy that? And I think a lot of Pauli Murray's work is critiquing America from a point of love, and also from the stepchild that never gets enough love, that's always like gaslighted about her experience. That's Black people in America. That's who we've always been. And the relationship that we have as Black Americans is very, very complicated. So thank you, all of you, for speaking so much truth to power tonight.
Well, and if we want to take it back and connect it to like abolition, right? That like we cannot abolish prisons, or we cannot have abolition if we cannot reconcile that our heroes have been violent, that they have caused irreparable damage to countless people, that they hold all of that in them just as much as they have their capacity to like mobilize hundreds and thousands of Black lives, right? Like that we can't, I don't see how we can get to abolition if we can't reconcile that or acknowledge the truth of like who our leaders and our heroes are.
Yes, and also just one thing to add to what you're saying, like how we treat each other. If we're going to transform this world, how can we do that when we don't show each other grace, when we don't show each other tenderness, or we use the same punitive and carceral systems and relationships that the state enforces on us to one another, right? And I think that the loving critique can be it's a constructive critique, right? And to take that critique into account, because we can't transform the world if we're not transforming ourselves. And so thank you for offering that loving critique, right? And recognizing these contradictions. I think when people pass on, we want to deify them in a way, right? And make them like as if they didn't make mistakes, but that's also dangerous too. And to Kristen, who will ask the last question, like, how do we not, reinforce or deify or make perfect these very human, very flawed people like ourselves, right? And so I thank y'all for y'all's offerings. And yes, I'll finally pass it over to Kristen.
No, thank you for that, Jamie, because I do feel like the sanitization, I don't know if I said that correctly, but the sanitizing of history is a part of the reason why we're here, is a part of the reason why so many Black and trans and queer people, and just women in general, anyone who's other, constantly falls through the cracks of history because we're so concerned with it being perfect by white supremacist standards. So I definitely think that sanitizing is 100% a part of the problem. We all want to say, oh, Martin Luther King did this, he did that, without ever talking about the sexism, the chauvinism, the ways that women were not allowed to speak, the ways that he took credit for Joanne Robinson's work, who was the backbone of the Montgomery bus boycott. And his career was absolutely skyrocketed. He got the spotlight and she had to just go about her work because she was working at a state institution, and she would have lost her job if everyone knew that she was the architect behind it. But whenever that was gone, whenever that like ended, Martin Luther King never gave her that credit. She never got that credit. So I definitely think that sanitizing things is a part of the problem. One last question for everyone here. And again, I want to thank you for speaking so much truth to power tonight. What are your hopes for the future of Black, trans, queer, and gender expansive narratives, histories, and archives?
Don't be scared, y'all. This is the last question. I'm gonna just like pop
I'll
it in the
go.
chat.
So this we have talked about, like, it has already come up, the unreliability of the archives, and the archives not being a site of like, not being like this site of like validation and legitimacy for Black trans people. So having said that, for me, I want the future of Black trans archiving and history to continue rejecting historicism as a politic and as an ethic and as a methodology. And so historicism tells us that things don't enter into discourse as meaningful subjects until you can tell a history about it from a point A to a point B. And we know this is like a narrative that gets weaponized against colonized people all the time because Indigenous people can't quote unquote, tell a history in this particular way. Indigenous people are not meaningful subjects in discourse because Black people can't tell a particular history in this particular way, and so forth, right? And so I want Black trans folks, Black trans archives, and so forth to reject historicism as a politic, as an ethic, as a methodology, right? And so it's not to say that Black trans people do not exist in the archives. There is Black trans people in the archive, but it is to say that the Black trans people who are there because of Black trans resistance, not because of the rigor or the legitimacy of the archives itself. So I need us to continue rejecting that notion. It's not to say do not write histories of Black trans people, do not create histories. What it is to say is do not create histories that are used to qualify as meaningful subjects worthy of study, worthy of representation. That's not what qualifies as legitimate, as valid. And I'll just lastly say that I know, especially in academic circles, it is really hard to advance Black trans projects right now because Black trans people are not seen as meaningful subjects and sites of study. And anytime you mention or put on the table, including an early iteration of the Black Trans Thought in History project that is coming out with Black women radicals, especially in academic discourse, you are told that Black trans people are not meaningful sites of study because there are no archives, because there is not enough historical evidence. And there's nothing that could be like more false than that, but I am of the opinion that anyone who needs to be convinced of that doesn't even deserve to be persuaded. So I just want to say that, like, moving forward, Black trans archival projects, Black trans historical projects, do this work, but don't do it as a qualifier of our legitimacy and of our presence having been here.
Thank you for that offering. Does anyone else want to jump in?
I really appreciate Naomi's offering, and it's like, what's the thing that I feel in the moment? I just appreciate when we can complicate the legitimacy of, like, so who gets to archive? What does archiving mean? And yeah, I think when you initially spoke, I was like, wait, so what do you want us to do? And then I was listening and I'm like, it is not the reliance on institutions, right? It is not the reliance on this machine, right, to be able to tell and to dictate the story. So I really appreciate that as someone who's moving into archiving, but comes from a traditional way, which, like, most of us do, right? Black people, especially African people, we have preserved and archived items, stories, right? Oral stories, even some people who are Christians, Bibles, right? Like, there's so many different things that we have kept. And even though the Smithsonian is not in the Smithsonian, it may not be in the Schomburg, it has been in our homes, right? And has been passed down. So I think my hope is that we all lean into more archival practices with, like, the value and the knowing that we don't need to reach some type of acclaim level or be affiliated with some type of institution to, like, deem our history as worthy of being preserved. Right. And that looks like the obituaries your grandma got in the closet, down to the first time you shook it down at the drag ball. Right. Like, what did I wear? What happened that night? What was the first flyer I went to organize at? Right. Like, how are we keeping these things? And I know that sometimes, like, we don't. Right. But I think the more we do, we can create a more accurate canon of our histories, because we've done it, and we've done it without institutions. And I think the thing that institutions are relying on, I don't know who want to call, but well, they're relying on us to do that so we can give it to them, right? So then co-stewardship comes into play so who tells the story? How is the story told? Which is what we see at the Blacksonian. right? Like we see so much powerful work that a lot of those curators put into creating it. But there's also some really interesting narratives around how enslaved Africans in particular are talked about, and how there's almost an erasure of queer history from that entire fucking exhibit, right? There might be 2 notices of like the homie, and then there's like one of Bayard Rustin. And I don't even think it says he was a Black gay man, right? Like, I don't even think that's in the motherfucking caption. So I think that if we become like the authors and the storytellers, and not become, continue like that work, and we create our own archives that are not affiliated with institutions that we can preserve in our homes and learn the ways of, this is how we preserve papers, this is how we preserve items. We don't need institutions to rely on, because just like how they have to come to you, Jamie, to Black women radicals for us to find so much shit, they'll have to come to us, right? Because then we become the holders of this knowledge that we already have been leading in for centuries.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I don't know, I just think that for all of us in our in our little lives and our little like day to day, that like the little things that we, that we matter enough to leave something behind. And and that anybody can do that, right? That's also the thing. Again, it goes back to Naomi's point about, not I love what you said, that like anyone who needs to be convinced like doesn't deserve to be persuaded, and anybody can archive their life or record their life. And I think about that as just like, I've been trying to like piece my like ancestry together on like ancestry.com, and it really has me like, thinking like my partner and I got, married, and we went to get our marriage certificate, and the clerk just like out of habit was like, check for mail. And I was like, no, remove that X, like, because you will not document me in that way. Right. And so I just hope that we can exercise our agency around how we leave how we leave behind evidence of our having been here. And also evidence of those who loved us, right? Because I think of Pauli Murray's aunt, who like back in the day was like, as long as you put a dress on to go to church, like you can be whoever you are trying to be, like that's evidence, right? So when you encounter a caregiver or a parent who just like cannot with their trans child and wants to act like it's something that is just like mind blowing, it's like, no, because somebody's caregiver was doing that back in the 30s and was doing that back in the 40s. So I know you can do it in 2022, right? That evidence is important. So I just hope we keep doing that.
Y'all, this evening has just been so much, like so in such a great way, and I deeply needed it. I think I deeply needed this space to be in and hear everybody and hear folk, because so often on my heart, in particular, African folks, being from the continent, in particular being from Ghana, and thinking about the trans, queer, and gender expansive community and all that folks are experiencing with this. The transphobia and the queerphobia has always been there. It's never not been, right? But still in witnessing them and hearing my folks still just be so, I don't even know how to, they make me think so much of just Pauli and just like the excellence of everything that Pauli would think of in terms of movement building, in terms of what it meant to be in this world. And I'm thinking of them, and I'm thinking of our conversations across borders. And I think that's my hope, like our continued conversation across borders and what we're learning from each other and how we are identifying similarities in these colonial systems and how they have dominated our lives and how we understand each other. I tell people all the time, most West African, most like sub-Saharan African languages, there is no gendered pronoun. you know? And so what that even means to be from a country where like what now we're thinking of the imposition of coloniality and how it's just so much. I'm thinking about so much, but these continued conversations and like being able to interview queer folks, trans folks has been one of the highlights, I think, of my current, like, because I'm like, wow, the beauty of that, like everybody's learning from each other, talking to each other, and being able to document that and read across has been just a blessing. So I hope that's what we continue to do, to learn from each other and learn, and that love is form of critique, I think is so deep as well, that I want to carry. And thank you all just for offering this space.
Wow. I just want to say deeply thank you for this revolutionary political education conversation that seemed to go by so fast because it was so brilliant, because we are actually at time, and wanted to, at some point leave room for questions, but unfortunately we're at time and I don't want to belabor our guests, but I want to say thank you, Trinice, Naomi, Dolores, and Nana, for your brilliance and for taking us there and for pushing us and for the self-reflection and for the critique and for community building and the self-determination, all centered around the radical queer Black feminist legacy of Pauli Murray. And from the bottom of my heart, I just thank y'all for your brilliance. I want to thank Kristen Mouten for co-hosting with me and also being the brainchild once again about the Whose Shoes Do You Stand In campaign, because it was Kristen's campaign idea while interning or working with the Pauli Murray Center. And that's like, I got an email and I saw the email and I responded real fast and said yes, because the campaign is so excellent. And I want to thank, Sophia Ross Hurtado, the program and communications coordinator for the Pauli Murray Center, for just everything and always being present and collaborating. And just thank you for your hard work and diligence in working with Black women radicals. And please take a look at the chat. Like, you should see how people are grateful for this conversation. And lastly, and I want to thank everyone, but Naomi Simmons-Thorne, thank you for being the catalyst to taking us there and for pushing us to be better and pushing us to be better in our praxis and to push us to be better in our scholarship and for pushing us to see Pauli Murray outside of biological essentialism, right? And to push us to see other leaders, whether in Black history or not, outside of who is seen as respectable or fit in a certain canon. So I want to thank you so much. This conversation will live on Black Women Radicals on YouTube for you to reference. And so I just want to give our give our panelists any last thoughts before we close out. I just want to say thank you again.
I just am really amazed. Being in space with everybody in this Zoom virtual world that we're all hanging out in now, I think it's really powerful and amazing to see folks doing fantastic work that, like, it makes it so clear to me that, like, we need all of us, because there's so much work that we're doing in the world that, like, we don't see on like a daily basis, and it's really easy to feel isolated and alone. And so I'm just really grateful to know that y'all are in the world and that you're doing the work that you're doing, and like, now that I like have learned something about that, and it's a gift, and I'm just like, man, like, the brilliance is just like, it's a lot. It's making me emotional.
Oh, please don't start crying, because I'm a big Sam. I will start crying immediately. I will cry thug tears. Trinice and Nana know, they be knowing. And Naomi, they know emotional. So thank y'all. Thank you, Dolores, so much. Does anyone else want to have any final thoughts? If not, that's okay. Just wanted to give you the floor.
Just want to remind folks that queering means reworking. You know, we really have to be committed to reworking and adding the nuance and complicating the stories with these figures that we think we know so well. You know, we really deify and make these folks like we were in personal relationships with them and we were not. And when we do that, it makes it really hard to talk about the contradictions and really validate their actual experiences. And shout out to all of you. I feel like I'm in like a scene of a movie and in a library, which is like my favorite kind of movie. And yeah, I'm just grateful to be around just Black queer folks who are not just excellent in thought, but in action and in intention.
Yes, if y'all ever come through the DC area, hit me up, come through.
Thank you all so much. This has been truly transformative and amazing. I am grateful for every panelist, for everyone who joined. Just thank you all so much.
Also, I just wanted to say thank you, Jamie, for just continuously pushing my piece and putting it in spaces where I don't have access to and many of us do not have access to. I also want to thank some of my closest friends, like Kim Smith, who I believe is also also attending, who was the one who actually put it in Jamie's comments for the first time. So thank you both to Kim and Jamie for just continuing to support my work. And I just want to make sure that after me, there are other Black trans women, Black trans femmes who are able to do the same thing. So many times Black trans women are not seen as contributors to our intellectual life, to our academic discourses. And it's not a coincidence that a Black trans woman was the one to really like mobilize that conversation.
Wow. Well, I feel fulfilled and I feel full. And I just want to say thank you to everyone. Thank you to Nana, Kristen, Dolores, Naomi, and Trinice, Sophia. And until we meet again, and I hope one day we can meet in person and just really have in-person community post the Rona one day. But just thank y'all so much for the conversation. And thank you, Pauli Murray. We stand on your blueprint and your foundation. So happy Black History Month and beyond. Happy Black Futures Month, right? And yeah, let's keep queering Black history and beyond. So have a great rest of y'all's evening, y'all, and be safe.